Okay, welcome everyone. Um, it is my great pleasure to introduce Tim Althoff. He is an associate professor in the School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington. He achieved his PhD from the Department of Computer Science in Stanford, and we know his work from various conferences where he also achieved Best Paper Awards, and he has a CKDD Dissertation Award and an NSF Career Award. So I look forward to his talk. I have been told there will be metaphors, so I look forward to them. Thank you, Tim. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, for inviting me in the first place. Thanks for this opportunity to share some of our recent work with you all that will be around human AI collaboration and language models in mental health. And specifically, I want to talk about, and we'll come back to some of these metaphors around training wheels, like on a bike, and how we can use language models like training wheels on a bike to improve mental health. I suspect that many of us on this call are aware of some of the recent advances of AI over the past few years. And to me, they have been really remarkable that we now have models like Gemini or ChatGPT that have become household names. In some sense, we have these machines that listen to us, that respond to us, that translate between languages, that solve at least some problems, that are able to learn and retrieve information, that seemingly express emotion. And all of that used to be science fiction, as of course our beloved C3PO was famously fluent in over 6 million forms of communication. And if I was in person with you all, which would be awesome, I would start with a quick poll. We'll now try to simulate that on Zoom. So I would ask you kind of who here learned how to ride a bike using training wheels, or perhaps use these training wheels for your own children, perhaps. And I suspect that at least some of you would be able to relate. And I would thanks for engaging in the chat already. Appreciate that. And I'm curious of everyone doing that, who is still using those training wheels? Mm. All right. Again, I suspect that most of us are not using these training wheels before, but for a brief period of time, they were really helpful. They were kind of able to help us learn. They made biking a little bit easier, helped us maybe to focus on one thing at a time rather than all the things at the same time. Like Matthias in the chat, I still have vivid memories of a big accident as a 4-year-old on a bike. Maybe I should have used them as well. But for this brief period, kind of we made a task easier in order to learn them using these training wheels. At the same time, the idea of these training wheels was that they eventually have to come off. They're only there to make us learn. And interestingly, sometimes we actually do the opposite. Sometimes we make intentionally things harder in order to help us learn. It's probably a bit hard to see in this picture, but this person here in front of this picturesque background is running at a high altitude. And if you look very closely, you actually see like a weighted vest that perhaps they're training for a competition near sea level. So sometimes we even make things harder in order to practice, in order to train. So making things harder can also be productive and desirable. And now there's some skills that I think are really important. They might help us improve our mental health, our relationships, perhaps could contribute to supporting our societies and democracies as well. And I'll share just a few examples that we focused on in recent work. The first of them is empathy. That's, for example, the ability to understand or share the emotion and experiences of others. Another such skill is emotional regulation, the ability to manage and express emotions appropriately. Another one is conflict resolution. That's our ability to address disagreements constructively. Conflict, of course, is normal, but it's good to have healthy ways of dealing with it. And while we could keep going on important skills, the last one I'll highlight, and we'll come back to in this talk, is cognitive flexibility or reappraisal. This means our ability to be open to new information, to be willing to change one's mind in the face of new evidence, being able to challenge our existing views and perspectives. And when I think about these skills, I'm not entirely honest that we're actually getting better at them. I don't have that impression personally. At the same time, I think they're really important. But to be fair, learning and exercising most, if not all of these skills is actually quite challenging. It can be quite uncomfortable, can even be painful. So why not outsource them to an AI language model if they're kind of assisting us with 1,000 other things already? Why not outsource kind of these skills too? And at least I think, thankfully, I'm kidding here. We already have these 24/7 AI assistants for about everything else. So why not this too? Well, we commonly find ourselves in scenarios where we actually need these skills. We need to be able to express them for direct personal or societal benefit. And in many of those situations, we can't have training wheels anymore. We might not have kind of AI at our fingertips. And I do worry about kind of these kind of all too convenient AI assistants that are often extremely agreeable. Often they have a need to be helpful to a degree that we start calling this pathologically helpful. They might kind of be biased towards reinforcing existing beliefs and biases without challenging us, withholding alternate viewpoint. And then when we actually need certain skills, we might not be ready. And if you don't have your own favorite examples of how agreeable these kind of models can be, I just kind of this is kind of an actual quote from ChatGPT, even though I abbreviated it because I wasn't comfortable putting the whole thing on the slide. I just randomly made something up. Today is Tuesday in both of our time zones. So I said, I think Tuesdays are just the worst day of the week. Don't you agree? And of course, the language model agreed. Tuesdays are the absolute worst, and going on with more strong opinions after that. So if we want to learn important skills, how would we learn them? How should we teach them? And thankfully, there's a lot we can build on from education and learning theory. We can begin by understanding a task through scaffolding and guided support, kind of using tools and structures that we can provide to grasp the basics. You might then move on to deliberate practice, practicing specific areas intentionally and purposefully. And finally, during or after each practice session, seek or reflect on constructive feedback and using that to refine your practice and improve your performance. And of course, these are things that, for instance, teachers do on a daily basis. And it's been kind of shown often that language can provide the scaffolding and practice and feedback. And behind all the work that I want to show you today is this hypothesis that if language can do that, language models might also be able to do that, providing scaffolding, practice, and feedback, creating new opportunities for learning that will apply in this mental health domain. And I'll come back one more time to this training wheel metaphor. I want to illustrate this hypothesis with two recent projects, and each project will teach what I think are important skills through AI-supported scaffolding and practice and feedback. But then we will measure performance without training wheels. I'm using this metaphor precisely because training wheels are designed to come off. And I will talk about how we can design human AI interactions that empower users to actually transition from this AI reliance to actual mastery of the skills that they're acquiring. Ensuring that AI supports more like a stepping stone rather than as a crutch. So ultimately, we're really thinking about how to design AI support here with, in some sense, planned obsolescence in mind. But we do this with the hope that this ultimately leads to more effective and sustained learning outcomes. All right, so we'll next jump into two projects that I want to use to illustrate that. And the first one will be about how self-guided tools that can teach you a critical mental health skills, specifically how to challenge and reframe negative thoughts. And I love starting with this picture. This is Nathaniel. Nathaniel did this with full consent. He was one of the individuals that shared his personal story in an art and mental health campaign that actually happened in the UK. So I'd be curious whether anybody actually came across this campaign called Let's Talk. I've been using this for a while, but I've rarely given talks in the UK about it. What I love about this picture is kind of clearly here we see the artist powerfully expressing his inner reality as lettering on his face. And I'm showing you this because it illustrates that we all have negative thoughts. We actually express them through language, even if we don't make it as explicit as the artist do here. So if, because so much about mental health is about language, I really believe that language models can have a meaningful impact in the space to help us with our mental health. And so as we set up, it's common to experience negative thoughts. Nathaniel isn't the only one. The following happens to be more often than I care to admit. I submit a paper, it gets rejected, and then I might have thoughts like, well, I'll never succeed as a researcher. And these thoughts can really matter because they relate to our feelings and our behaviors. For instance, with thoughts like that, I might have feelings of self-doubt and frustration. I might engage in behaviors that are ultimately not in my best interest, maybe procrastinating, but it's really difficult to challenge some of these thoughts. They're often entrenched and automatic, they're emotionally triggering. Thankfully, there's a proven therapeutic techniques to challenge these negative thoughts called cognitive reframing or cognitive restructuring. And the basic idea is really to challenge your negative thought with a different, more balanced, reframed thought. So for instance, one way to reframe my negative thought is to say, well, it's normal to feel disappointed when a paper gets rejected. And I can use this experience to learn and grow. And this type of process is at the kind of offers an alternative perspective, leading to often healthier feelings and behaviors. Maybe I feel better about myself, my self-worth, I'm more optimistic. I might seek feedback from friends or colleagues like I am doing right now. And this process or intervention is really central to a particular popular form of evidence-based therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, how do people do this today? In many ways, the state of the art is a piece of paper. And again, this is really difficult for people to do, especially on their own, especially in the moment when they're challenging with something. And the status quo is roughly to do this exercise in a piece of paper. Here in this right column, you see this alternate thought, where in many ways we're faced with a pretty kind of emotionally charged and difficult task. And often all we get is an empty text box, either because maybe if you're lucky to work with a therapist, maybe they print this out and send you home or send you a PDF. For most people in the world, they at best have access to a PDF online. It's a very difficult task. And again, we're facing an empty text box. As I mentioned before, these negative thoughts are entrenched and automatic and emotionally triggering. They're actually quite difficult to deal with in the moment. Professional therapists are amazing at teaching you these type of skills, but unfortunately, access to them for most people on the planet is very, very limited. And that has to do with shortages, with lack of insurance coverage, still a lot of stigma, and so on. So this led a collaborating organization called Mental Health America and our research team to hypothesize that, well, maybe we can use some form of human-AI collaboration to provide better scaffolding that would make this type of task easier to engage with and that we could still make widely accessible. And next, I'm going to show you a demo of what this looks like. So this was done in collaboration with mental health experts and lived experience experts at Mental Health America. And if you're familiar with this cognitive reframing intervention, the steps will not be shocking to you, and I'll point out as we go through where exactly AI really comes in. So here we start with the negative thought we're struggling with. Again, I'll never achieve success as a researcher, in the hope that somebody will find this relatable. At the bottom here, you see what many others, these are some of the most popular negative thoughts that people put in. And there's quite heavy stuff like, no one cares about me, I'm a failure, I'll never be able to do anything, I'm worthless, I'm scared that something bad happens to the people that I love. Next, we ask about a situation in which this thought came up with, and that's something that we learned where it's for AI to be helpful at all, they really need to know enough about you, enough context to even have a chance of being helpful. And we found that kind of asking for a recent situation can really help with that. So here, I once again submitted a paper and it got rejected. And now AI comes in for the first time. Here we explain these, psychologists would call them cognitive distortions. Here we present them as thinking traps in an attempt to be slightly more accessible. And of course, everybody could learn the skill if we're willing to kind of sit down, maybe with a cognitive behavioral therapy book. You're willing to read through 50 or so pages. So you could learn about all the different, types of cognitive distortions and how to challenge them. The truth is that for most people in the moment, that's a pretty tall ask, and very few of us actually do that. And here we can first just use a simple classifier that figures out in my thought what's actually going on, what kind of patterns do we suspect are going on here. And we see that kind of our system highlights, well, maybe what I've been doing is overgeneralizing, maybe fortune telling, all or nothing thinking, all of which relate to this thought I expressed to a decent degree. I can then pick one and we can challenge that one specifically. And now the most challenging part comes in the empty text box I showed you on the right-hand side of this worksheet. Now we want to reframe the thought. We want to find at least a starting point how we can challenge this thought. And here, this is typically where people would drop out in these type of interventions, where people find it really, really challenging to come up with alternate perspectives. And here we use a language model that we built to suggest 3 starting points. We intentionally choose 3 in the hope that everybody using this tool would find at least one that they can actually relate to. So I'll read some of them out. One says, it's normal to feel disappointed when something doesn't go as planned. I can use this experience to learn and grow. I'm sure I'll have more success in the future. Another one says, rejection is a part of the process. I'll take the feedback I received and use it to improve my paper and submit it again. Now, these are not meant to do your thinking for you. This is really where the active ingredient lies in this type of intervention, but they're meant to be a starting point that a lot of people find challenging to identify themselves. So in contrast, right, like here we have this worksheet again with an empty text box, and this is how we try to provide additional scaffolding, kind of using language models for people to learn this skill. And as I mentioned, in collaboration with mental health experts, clinical psychologists, patient advocates, after systematic ethics and safety considerations, after ensuring high quality and safety, we actually deployed this model on the Mental Health America website to conduct a large randomized field studies with actual visitors to this website with lived experience of mental health conditions as participants. This has now been running for almost 2 years. We have some number over 160,000 participants so far, which personally I found striking because it's actually quite difficult to find. I have the URL here, a QR code. I'm also sharing that, I believe, on my last slide if anybody wants to try it out. But what this allowed us to do was actually to really learn about how to best deliver these interventions through dozens and dozens of A/B tests and randomized trials. For example, we learned pretty quickly, and that got us quite excited, that engagement improved drastically. This intervention I introduced to you is a very well-known intervention. The website, kind of this Mental Health America organization that we work with, they already had a tool for that. It just was basically just a digitized version of this type of worksheet. But as we see here at the top, people were not finishing this tool, and kind of completion rates were abysmal. And while there's still a lot of room for improvement, kind of by redesigning this process, by providing scaffolding that we believe kind of at kind of key pieces of this process, we were able to see higher completion rates. And it really strikes me that we can actually, even though we never tried to deliver this in a particularly cost-effective way, we can already do this for a cent or even fraction of a cent that is actually cheaper than printing out kind of this worksheet, and especially much cheaper if a human being has to hand you this sheet of paper in the first place. But we found it wasn't only more engaging, it actually led to better reframing outcomes as well. So all the numbers I'm going to show you now are from different RCTs where the key treatments will compare were actually randomized. So here we find that people rate the reframes they can come up with in this human AI collaboration condition as more helpful. And here we're comparing like pixel by pixel identical versions of this intervention, where the only difference is whether we have AI help you in the process of identifying which type of thinking trap it is, and to start with the reframe. We also have participants say that they actually find they are able to learn the skill better in this human AI collaboration condition rather than having it to do by themselves. We find that it helped people feel better within just a few minutes. That's not actually the primary goal here, though it's nice to see. The actual goal is to teach the skill of identifying, challenging your own negative thoughts. But of course, we're happy to take this. And on average, we see about a 2-point reduction on a 10-point scale for this kind of 3 to 5 minute intervention. And about 2/3 of people feel strictly better afterwards. Now, kind of making it, in order to make it as effective as we can, there are some things we knew when we started this project and some things we didn't. If you kind of read through the clinical psychology literature, it was well known that these kind of, what should these reframes even look like to be particularly effective? Well, what you would have found is, well, they should be relatable to the individual. Otherwise, they're quickly worthless. They need to be helpful in overcoming the negative thought, but they also should be memorable to be accessible the next time a similar thought arises, because chances are you had that same negative thought before, chances are you will have it again. So it's really good if you can also retrieve kind of your ability to challenge this in the future. However, what we didn't know and what we couldn't find in the literature is, what does it actually mean for these reframes to be more relatable, more helpful, and more memorable? How do we actually do that? Kind of one technical contribution here was to come up with this framework of linguistic attributes of reframed thoughts. And this includes, for instance, whether a reframe is particularly rational or positive or empathic or actionable or specific or readable. And then we developed natural language processing techniques to measure and control the level of these attributes that we, while I'll skip that, we also evaluated them with domain experts and made sure that we're actually capturing these complex linguistic constructs in a meaningful way. Here's what we found. You might remember that we show you 3 reframes every time. So we also kind of randomize which type of reframes we show, and then we can, for instance, track what do people click on. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're clicking on the one that would have been best for you, but what do you prefer? Here's what people preferred. People clicked a lot more often when the reframes were highly specific. They also like clicking on them if they were highly empathic. That makes us feel better. Turns out it's not actually any better in terms of how we learn these skills, but we're more willing to engage, and that's a meaningful outcome in the first place. We found that just making them more positive was actually not preferred at all. It's kind of easy to just take something negative, replace it with something positive that then you can really not relate to. And finally, at least on average across a large population, there was this medium level of complexity or readability level of the language that seemed to be best overall. Now, this is what people clicked on. What was actually associated with the best possible outcomes? So I mentioned we want to have reframes be relatable, helpful, and memorable. And here's the subset of constructs that actually kind of move things into these directions. If we wanted to make reframes more relatable, we learned to make them more rational. And while I kind of never properly defined this construct, what we mean by that is making fewer assumptions about you, and specifically assumptions about your financial or social resources, for instance, could vary dramatically between people. And making assumption that something is available to you, for instance, is a great way of making something not relatable. So we learn our models, we train them in order to make kind of few assumptions about you beyond the things you actually shared. In order to be helpful, it helps to actually challenge the specific thinking trap that you select and to make things actionable and specific. And those two ingredients of actionable and specific were also the two key ingredients to make things more memorable, in the hope that you can remember this reframe the next time a similar thought arises. Now, this is what we learned across kind of a broad population in terms of how to optimize how we come up kind of or generate these reframes. Just because it works on average doesn't mean it works for everyone. That's a common problem. But from an ethics principle of equity, it was important to us that this works the best we can for all populations. And I know there's 1,000 tiny numbers on this slide. I don't expect anybody to learn, but what to be able to read. But what I highlight is it wasn't actually, for instance, race and ethnicity along which the experiences differed the most. It was adolescents and teenagers, people between 13 and 17 that consistently across all the different outcomes we were tracking had the worst resources. Here you see a bunch of red, and red here means that it was kind of statistically significantly different and lower than the population mean. So then we set out to, and this is actually a really key demographic, both in mental health in general, as well as for this particular organization, Mental Health America, that we work with. So we set out to figure out why do they seem to have a worse experience? And after some digging, what we found is that people under 18 on our side use much simpler language, meaning shorter words and shorter sentences when interacting with these tools. Maybe that matches your own experiences or experience with kids, perhaps. Here you see a kind of across age that, at least on average, the older people they use more complex words, longer sentences. So we came up with the not too shocking kind of attempt of like, well, what would happen if we actually generated reframes that follow this kind of more simple, less complex, and often more casual language? So we do everything as before, but we kind of use yet another language model just to make this text slightly easier to understand and make it more casual. And we saw that it actually increased relatability. Kind of people found it more relatable. This is for 13 to 14-year-olds. They find it more helpful and more relatable just with this kind of relatively simple adaptation of the language. And we find that at least none of the other attributes actually decreased by kind of making this change. Now, after some of these promising RCT results on kind of large populations in the wild, we then also invested in a classic pre-registered clinical trial, and again found similarly encouraging results. Here we see that for now these are much kind of smaller groups, so you also see some larger confidence in intervals. Here we see that a group using this human-AI collaboration condition, people again reported that the reframes were more effective when they had access to AI support, and they also ended up using the tool more often. So the way we think about this, we cannot strictly prove, but the way we make sense of these findings is that especially somebody's kind of first usage of the tool, if you have additional support, you often have a better experience, and people that might have a better first experience might end up using the tool more often as well. And now I do want to come back to our training wheel metaphor. So here we measure how well are you actually doing this cognitive reframing. We use a established scale to measure that. That's what's on the y-axis. But importantly, here we ask you how much can you apply this skill in your own life outside the tool. This is not when you have kind of the training wheels available to you. This is if you're kind of on your own, training wheels off, are you actually able to exercise this skill? So like items in this kind of scale would ask you things like, I caught myself thinking negatively, recognized the negative bias and reevaluated the situation, or I often caught myself thinking in an irrational way and I'm actively working to develop more rational views. Kind of people say this more often in a trial where during the first 4 weeks, we have them actually use the tool a couple times, and then we had an 8-week follow-up. But again, we ask these questions outside the tool, and we see that people get better and better. We guess that maybe 4 weeks would be the right amount for people to learn this. Seems like we're currently plateauing after 3 weeks already. But importantly, also, we see that those learning outcomes are sustained after 8 weeks, where people, at least for 4 weeks, have no access whatsoever to this tool. And even prior to that, we're able to apply it more and more in their own lives as well. This is what I wanted to share about kind of tool number one, project number one. We'll now switch gears to a second skill, but we'll still think about how we can use AI models to provide scaffolding and practice and feedback. And now we'll focus on the skill of having difficult conversation and conflict resolution. I'll just start by saying, maybe you can relate, that actually many important conversations in life are quite difficult to have. Perhaps you're discussing kind of healthcare options with an aging parent. Maybe you're negotiating a salary, and maybe you have a friend hurt your feelings. And all of those conversations can be scary at times. Sometimes we avoid having them, but they're often important for us in our relationships. They're difficult for multiple reasons. Many of us have never been trained in having those conversations particularly effectively. Like we just don't know what's the best strategy to start this conversation, how to negotiate and when to do that, how to best express my own needs. At the same time, there's also complex emotions that play a role. So even if in principle, you're very able to have these kind of conversations, once things get a bit more heated, it's actually quite difficult, and you might end up not expressing the skills the way you want to. Now, if you're really lucky, and this is true for very few people, you might have access to kind of in-person training with experts. What they would do is they might simulate having these difficult conversations, do some role play. They might provide you just-in-time feedback. What really, at best, most people have access to is kind of online resources like worksheets and so on, maybe lists of kind of how to have these conversations. And what we find is that actual simulation or practice and specific feedback can be effective, just not accessible to most. And what's accessible tends to be a lot less effective. And I'll show you RCT results in the end again that also substantiate exactly kind of this perspective. What I'm going to tell you about next is a system we called Imbue, which is this interactive training system that is again backed by language models. What it will do is it simulates the difficult conversations we're concerned about having. It provides just-in-time feedback and focuses both on these kind of strategic conversational skills as well as of the emotion regulation aspects that are important for you to be able to have those conversations in a meaningful way. Now, you might have your own examples, but it turns out computer scientists might not be experts necessarily in conflict resolution. So thankfully, we get to collaborate with amazing psychologists, and there's many well-established frameworks on how to teach these type of skills. The one we embraced here in this work is called the Dear Man framework in dialectical behavioral therapy. So the name fails to suggest this is not actually a gender-specific framework. And this framework includes both conversational strategies, like are you describing the facts of the situation with any judgment? Are you expressing your emotions using I statements and so on? And it also has these kind of mindfulness or emotional regulation skills. What I'll show you next, and again, this will be a bit difficult to read. The first demo that I showed you was nice on screen because we optimized it for mobile devices. This one was on a kind of desktop environment, so I'll read out the important parts. I'm just showing you this to get a rough understanding of how the flow of this type of kind of training intervention worked. All right, so first we start with a situation. In this case, I'm using my dad has difficulty remembering taking his medication. I want to hire a nurse to take care of him. He disagrees. He thinks he doesn't need help. My goal in this conversation might be to convince my dad to accept hiring an assistant for him. Now what we can do first is we can click to get a skill suggestion. I might have no idea how to start. And especially when we have, at the very beginning of the conversation, starting by describing the facts can be a good thing. So this is what our system suggests here. We then, we kind of click here to get the skill suggestion. Our system says, hey, why don't you start by describing? We then get to actually choose what do we want to do. Maybe a bit boring, but we do exactly what the system suggested in this first demonstration here. Now I get to write out where I try to express this strategy. Might say, hey, you kept forgetting to take your meds. It's so bad for your health. And now we can get some feedback next. Let's see what the feedback is. Here it says, well, to improve the objectivity, you can kind of rephrase this. For instance, like how many times has the medication really been forgotten? And I get to, after this feedback, try and integrate this into a new response. What then happens once we submit this message, we actually simulate this conversation. So we simulate also, in this case, my dad as a conversation partner who responds, and we can have possibly even multiple rounds of this type of conversation to really practice it. So again, here on a high level, there's these two key components to the system. One is a simulation of a participant-provided communication scenario. Here we, for instance, could simulate a dad who appreciates my concern but doesn't really need any help. He can take care of himself just fine. And we have this, and I'll substantiate that in a few minutes, kind of expert-like just-in-time feedback that both focuses on, well, what skills are good to express at this moment. For instance, if I say, oh, you constantly forget to take your meds, it's so bad for your health, we might give feedback like, well, how many times is constantly, right? Like these are kind of some great ways for the conversation to derail rather early. Maybe it's a better idea to avoid some of this judgmental language, like it's so bad for your health as well. All right, so here we formulate this as kind of several computational tasks. So the first thing we do is, given a situation, an utterance by the user themselves, and a skill that they want to express, we can assess how well are you actually expressing the skill. So in this case, we come up with, well, this is a weak describe, and here's some improvement suggestions that we generate. And the next, the other thing we do is, given a situation, given whatever your conversation partner said, in this case, my dad, we can generate a suggested skill, like what would be kind of the right thing to do in this situation. In order to train models to do this, we work with expert clinicians that are kind of experts in this particular form of therapy and use this regularly. We also work with kind of lay people represented by crowdsourced workers, where we just collect a lot of different real-life situations that people report that they're struggling with. Kind of what type of situations are we avoiding to have? I won't go into all the technical details, but feel free to kind of ask me later. I want to tell you about kind of how well this worked. And to be honest, I was shocked and impressed in two different ways. One thing I expected a strong language model like GPT-4 to do a little bit better. This 6% means, as rated by human experts, how often was the feedback that the machine generates kind of practically the same as what the expert generated? Kind of how often are they basically communicating and attaching to the same thing? This didn't happen very often for kind of vanilla language models, even decent ones like GPT-4. And by adding a few bells and whistles that include kind of chain of thought reasoning, retrieval augmented generation, using a particular form we call contrasting pairs, we got this number up to over 80%. So over 80% of the time, we're suggesting essentially the same thing that the expert would have mentioned. And while I won't go into like some of the numbers here on the right, these are different automatic metrics for evaluation. While they all point roughly in the same direction, they all fail to capture these rather massive differences in kind of actual kind of expert impression of the quality of the results. So at least to me, this I think continues to add some caution about kind of automatic evaluations of really complex psychological constructs, because our methods, while they sometimes work decently, they at least in this case really failed to highlight this kind of fairly dramatic difference. Now, of course, the proof is in the pudding. So we again did a randomized trial here with about 80 or 90 people to see whether we can actually teach people those skills. Here we ask each participants to provide two communication scenarios that they find very difficult. What we mean by that is like a 7 to 9 on a 9-point Likert scale. And we have two conditions that we then randomize. Some people will only have access to the simulation, and some people will have access to the simulation and feedback, again, randomized. What I want to specifically highlight is we try to set this up in a very conservative way. So in both variants, people actually get kind of the traditional way of teaching with these tools is often in the form of these worksheets that your DBT therapist, if you had access to one, would give you. So we actually, before we even get started, we hand everybody kind of these worksheets to work through. So if we see any kind of post, kind of after to before improvement, this would be beyond what's provided by kind of traditional forms of teaching these skills using, for instance, these worksheets. So the study procedure had several steps. So I'll kind of explain them one more time, and then we'll look at some of the results. Each participant will come in and they will kind of give a hard situation and an even harder situation. And we use the even harder situation as a holdout for now that we'll use later. Now we will kind of give people these worksheets. We will then ask them about like, well, how uncomfortable are you about having this conversation? Have you been avoiding it, and so on. And then before any training, we actually evaluate how good are you at having this conversation by simulating it for the first time and just kind of measuring using classifiers we built, how well are you expressing these skills? Some might be better than others. Now the randomization happens where it's a training wheels on scenario. Here now, some people will have simulation and feedback. Some people will get the simulation only. And then we take the training wheels off. We kind of talk about, we have another instance of the same kind of conversation scenario, and we will measure outcomes. How well are you having this conversation? How uncomfortable are you having this conversation? And then finally, now we take this kind of holdout scenario of an even more difficult situation to test whether the skills you may or may not have learned actually generalize to a new conversation scenario. What we care about are three different things. We care about, are you actually learning the skills and able to express them? We measure this automatically using classifiers we built and evaluated. And then we capture whether negative emotions are being reduced and whether you feel confident in your ability to have these conversations, both through self-report. So I'll now talk us through some of the findings. So you'll see lots of S's and S plus F. So this is simulation-only condition and simulation and feedback. And the y-axis is improvement after training. So this is kind of a post minus pre situation. And what we find is in terms of skill mastery, only if you have access to feedback, you actually improve. Just simulating it did not lead to this automatically. And this was true both for the conversational kind of strategy skills as well as your emotional regulation skills. It seems like you really need the feedback to be able to improve. Just some practice without this feedback is not enough. Next, we look at negative emotions. So how angry or fearful are you about having this conversation? Oops, here we go. And here what we find, actually the simulation alone already reduces negative emotions like fear and sadness, but you see higher reductions when people also had feedback available. And then for some like anger, only the simulation plus feedback condition was able to statistically significantly reduce the amount of anger people felt in response to this situation. And then for the final part, what about people's self-efficacy? How confident are you? How much do you worry about having this conversation? Are you hopeful about this conversation? Are you motivated to have it? Here we see that, again, just the simulation alone can help with that already, to improve your confidence, to reduce worry. But again, we see much higher much higher improvements whenever there was feedback actually available as well. And for some, specifically hopefulness and motivation, only the feedback condition actually improved significantly on that. So this was a lot. So to summarize, the system provides scaffolding, deliberate practice, and constructive feedback. Over 80% of the times, this is kind of essentially at the quality of the best experts we could find in this particular technique. We only evaluated a single session, which may or may not have been enough to, but it did demonstrably improve skills. We do find that if you really want to improve on the conversational skills, it does require not only simulation, but also feedback. But the simulation alone actually led to some initial benefits on the emotional side already. Now, I usually spend a much longer part of my talks on ethics than I did today, but I did this in favor of showing you some of the most recent demos, and I wanted to try out this new training wheel idea, to be honest. There's feel free to ask about this. There's a lot that we do in terms of developing and deploying this technology responsibly that especially benefits from co-designing these tools with all the various stakeholders and by operationalizing principle-based ethics frameworks in this work. Personally, I'm really convinced that we can use AI tools to really teach people meaningful skills. I showed you two examples in this talk, but across kind of some of the work we've been up to, we've seen this also in empathy. We've seen this in other forms of conflict resolution where we focus on clinician-patient communication. We're currently working on doing this in a context of identifying and correcting misinformation and reducing polarization, and also use it in another project right now on Reddit to give people creative feedback on creative tasks like photography, for instance. So I look forward to the Q&A. What I wanted to convince you of is that we can use some form of human-AI collaboration, that when designed right can really teach us certain mental health skills through scaffolding, practice, and feedback. I'll just say we're very happy and grateful for the organizations we get to work with. Some of the tools and insights that I presented are now used by organizations that serve over 10 million people in the US. And we're deeply grateful to the counselors, peer supporters, advocates that use their time and energy, even their suffering, to support others. And of course, without them, we wouldn't be able to do it. Here's the amazing people that made this work possible. I'll highlight Ashish and Inna. They were the PhD students leading the first and second project, respectively. If you want to try out the tool yourself, you can do that here. And I look forward to a Q&A. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I'll clap for everyone. Audience, if you want to put your questions in the chat, I'll read them out. I will wait for that, but I will start perhaps with a question while we wait for people typing. You have mentioned that you want to use this, you tried to use the GDP4, but it wasn't as good. So I wonder if you have a feeling that this will change with time, or if you think that perhaps this is your research is helping it. And then the second question is about the technical challenges that you face. You talked very briefly about the techniques you used to improve the basic modeling, but you haven't told us a bit more. So I don't think you have the time to do that, but maybe you can share a little nugget on that. And perhaps I see someone raising their hands. If they can put a question in the chat, please.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So first of all, I think that language models, I know, somewhat automatically will just get better on all these things? Maybe, but I'm not holding my breath, in part because I think it depends on how do we train these models, with what kind of data sets and objectives in mind. And I think we're currently making lots and lots and lots of assumptions that if we keep making those assumptions, I don't think models will drastically get better at some of the critical pieces here. To give one example, especially in kind of reinforcement learning from human feedback, RLHF, alignment type directions, people often focus on, oh, this needs to be helpful and safe, and we need to do it in one conversation turn. And this process, among others, I think really leads to these super, super, super agreeable models that I know always give you one paragraph with 5 to 7 bullets, et cetera, et cetera. And this is often what we don't actually need in this world, where, for instance, in this project, we're talking about conflict resolutions. We want to simulate conversation partners that are not agreeable, that it can be kind of difficult to talk to. And we're actively training models to be biased against that. So I think there's lots and lots of examples like this, where unless we really challenge very fundamental assumptions, also the fundamental assumption of all of this has to happen in one conversation turn, you can't ever say, and that's the conversation turn in itself. For at least most of the time, how we train these models, I don't expect meaningful behavior to just emerge if we keep making those assumptions. On the technical challenges, I'll highlight maybe one nugget around these contrasting pairs here, which was a kind of a significant improvement. So this was a retrieval augmented approach where we kind of use in-context examples to help the model give better feedback. But what we found helped a lot, rather than just retrieving the most similar examples, as you might often do with these type of systems, we would try to retrieve the most similar ones, but then a kind of parallel pair that's often a much better demonstration in the same context. So the kind of similar to contrastive learning type ideas, and that really helped improve the model performance drastically.
Thank you. I see Ian has put a question in the chat about the existing commercial LLMs. And so given that they are constantly updated, some of them are pathologically helpful, but then the next release, they might become realistic, is writing. How do you think this can be mitigated to control the usefulness and quality of the interventions while balancing that new models are often more capable and powerful. I think you partially answered already, but
yeah, this is a really great question and a deep concern. As I mentioned in my previous response, in some sense, I wish they would suddenly start working kind of much better in the ways we do. And while kind of some version of that, well, like is likely to happen also with extreme investments in these type of models, at the very least, we still have this model that like we use closed models behind APIs. Things can change without you knowing. In high-risk situations like this one, this could be a massive concern. So we're doing kind of extreme amounts of testing in order to balance that. But I think your question really highlights to me the need for much better evaluation techniques, including automated evaluation techniques. I used this slide to highlight earlier how insufficient many of our kind of best ways of automatically evaluating these kind of algorithms and models currently are. One aspect that I'm the most concerned about perhaps is around safety. How can we kind of sleep at night, kind of putting models out in the world, kind of ensuring that this is really safe to use, also safe to use for people with mental health conditions where the risks are just higher than book you a restaurant reservation scenario. So your question really highlights for me the need for much better automated evaluation tools, especially kind of for everything, but especially and most urgently for safety aspects. We currently do a lot of kind of red teaming-like approaches where we're actively working on really improving the capabilities of fully automated versions so that we can continuously monitor the models that we use and kind of evaluate them over time in relatively cost-effective ways as well.
Okay, thank you very much. We're over the hour, so I will stop the conversation here. I will thank the audience. Audience, see you next week. There is another talk. And Tim, just stay around for a little bit longer while the audience leaves. Thank you again.
I really appreciate it.